Hello, this is HomeGrown
Yes.
Theology. I'm Trip.
I'm Bo.
This is coming right at you in the Bat Cave in Redondo Beach.
This is our first episode in a 7-part series called HomeGrown Christianity. It is our attempt at some eco-theology, some Christian ecology.
Bo, where did this idea come from?
There are a number of books and authors and thinkers who are addressing on the ground in local communities issues related to our environmental and ecological situation of the 21st century. And there were so many of them that I decided to lump them all together. If you look, you'll see a new logo for this series. It's green.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Is it a leaf?
Well, no, but the monk is eating instead of drinking. So here's what this series is going to look like. So the first episode here is Leah Kostamo, and she works at a Christian bird sanctuary is the best way I can describe it. She's better at describing it than I am, but
Like the Ark.
yes, just across the Canadian line. She's up in Vancouver, British Columbia, just south of there, in between Seattle and Vancouver. The second episode next week is with Matthew Sleeth, The Gospel According to the Earth. Then we talk with Jen Butler from George Fox, their new ecology program, Christian Earthkeeping.
Yes, and George Fox, by the way, is a new featured sponsor at HomeGrown Christianity. So when you're thinking about your schooling, think, I'm going to check out George Fox because they have this amazing new tagline, Bo. Say it in your deep, theologically attractive voice.
George Fox Evangelical Seminary, a safe place to ask dangerous questions.
Yeah.
Nice.
Anyway.
Then we talk with Randy Woodley, Shalom in the Community of Creation. Then we talk with John Cobb. Then we also do a thing about bringing food to the table. So I have a number of people that I'm talking to, whether they're in intentional communities or whether they've chosen a different lifestyle, and what it looks like for different shape, size, and configured families to get food on the table. And then Tripp and I are doing a TNT where we interact with those 6 interviews. It's going to be fantastic.
Yeah, and in that TNT, I will also explain the developments of eco-philosophy coming out of later Heidegger and that kind of stuff. It'll be fun.
Yeah, nice. So
See,
this
you
series
should tempt us for that TNT.
Yeah.
Because I can already tell that Bo is trying to make this series practical. And
I am prone to that.
I know, but I mostly like large abstract ideas, even if they are about really practical, ethical, sweeping, systemic challenges like, our ecological crisis. But it's just I really feel that TNT will have to be filling in the nerdy gaps. I really want to. So we need the deacons to click the speak pipe and say, "All right, well, I get how a community." Like a church could organize and do X, Y, and Z together and advocate this way or do these practical things so we don't kill ourselves on the planet. That's nice, Bo. But I just really want to know how Heidegger's later philosophy and its look at technology could develop into an eco-philosophy.
Oh, okay.
See, that's a sample.
Yeah, well, I think that's why you and I are a good 1-2 punch. But here's the thing.
Nonviolent punch.
2 things about this series. Number 1, I want to thank Jesse Turi, our elder of graphical sweetness, for coming up with the new logo for us. And actually, in the coming years, anytime we do something that addresses Christian earthkeeping or eco-theology, anything related to that, we'll put this in the series. So it's going to start as a 7-part series, but it'll grow from there. But I want to thank him for coming up with the new logo. And I also just want to say, as a teaser, that the 6 authors that we interview in this series, at the end of each interview, we ask them the same 5 questions. The TNT that you and I are going to do, the 7th part, is going to be playing question 1 from the 6 authors back to back. And then question 2, like we did with Fretheim and Brueggemann, and interacting with them as if we're all in the same room having this conversation. So all 6 authors, we ask the same 5 questions at the end of the interview, and we save them for the TNT. And by the way, the 5th and final question is always the same, which is this. In 1972, John Cobb asked, "Is it too late?"
Yes, first eco-philosophy.
Yeah, so... I mean, Bill McKibben said in 1979 we reached the tipping point, right? Which is why we have to add an extra A to Earth, because we're living on a different planet.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an interesting series. I'm really looking forward to these conversations. Leah Kostamo is an amazing person, and she is so inspiring when you listen to her and the heart and how this movement she's a part of has grown. And I know that people are going to want to connect. We will link to it in the show notes. Follow up with her. She's also on Twitter now, and she's a great conversation partner.
All right. Well, there you go. Homebrewed Christianity Deacons, homegrown theology coming at you. I just wanted to make sure that you know that on March 14th, Deacons, you can join me and Pete Rollins here in Los Angeles for a little day-long workshop. Then we're going to be headed over to Monkish Brewing Company that night, and we're going to have a little podcast love there. And we will be we'll be celebrating a release of a brand new beer themed for Atheism for Lent.
Uh-oh.
So there's that live all-day workshop. Pete and I, Tad's going to be there. Ryan Bell, who's doing his year as an atheist, is going to be there. So there's a day-long event, podcast at night, and also all during Lent is Atheism for Lent, high-gravity class, Homebrewed Christianity, Peter Rollins. Sign up now.
Yeah, and make sure to mark your calendars the end of March. We're going to be down at Transform in San Diego, and we're putting on the Friday night party.
Yes, and by party, we want to add an extra A because this party has been escalated.
Hey, Homebrewed Christianity, this is Bo Sanders, and as you know, we are launching into our Homegrown Christianity series. And our first author is Leah Kostamo, the author of Planted. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for agreeing to be here. I'm so excited to walk through this new book with you. It's not exactly a memoir per se, but it is basically the story of how this most recent chapter of your life has developed.
It is, yeah. It is the story of my husband and I helped start the very first Christian environmental center in Canada with an organization called A Rocha. It's a weird name. It's Portuguese for the rock because this organization started in Portugal 30 years ago. So we did that about 13 years ago. We started this environmental center down in British Columbia.
So we're going to take a little bit of a tour of locations to get here because you actually start out in Arizona. Mm-hmm. You grew up in Arizona.
I did.
Which is both a long way from Portugal and British Columbia.
It is. My family, we're from Arizona, but my grandparents lived on a little island called Orcas Island. It's in the Puget Sound in the Northwest. And going there every summer, our neighbors were these amazing people, Frank and Dorothy Richardson. He was an ornithologist, a studier of birds, and she was a biologist who graduated with a master's degree in biology from UCLA in the 1920s as a woman, so that was pretty remarkable. Their just lifestyle, love of creation had this huge impact. And I tell this little story in my book about going to their house one day and they're cleaning up from lunch and there's these little teeny bones on their plate. And so I'm going to look at those quizzically and ask them, like, what were you eating? Like, what creature has bones that small? And then they told us the story that they were driving home from town and a robin flew into their windshield and died. And so they got out of the car and picked up the robin and then brought it home and cooked it for lunch. So this is the kind of people that they were, and we never went as far as eating roadkill ourselves. But I think that their influence and just the time, they kind of became like my third set of grandparents, really had an impact in both my vocation and my passions.
So you would be down in Arizona for the year, and water was an issue there. You tell the story about how even during that time, the cities would use this ancient aqueduct made by the Hohokam Indians, and once a month it would flood in the relief.
Yeah, so that's just we lived in an old orchard, grapefruit orchard, so that it was part of the orchard people who ran the orchard tapped into this canal system. So, growing up in the desert, you are a bit obsessed with water. I mean, I think we shield ourselves from the reality. I mean, in Arizona, like, you get in your car, you drive to the mall, you get out, there's water fountains everywhere. But if you're outside for any length of time in the desert, you start becoming a bit obsessed with water. So going to an island every summer surrounded by water and verdant green, rainforest, it had a huge impact in the way I viewed creation and valued both where I was from and then this new place that I loved.
Yeah. So then in the summers you would go up to a place completely surrounded by water.
Mm-hmm.
And but these people next door, their passion was for birds.
Yeah. And, their passion was for everything. We would take walks, and he knew the Latin names for every plant that we would see. And their house was this little wooden kind of log house that they built themselves. They had running water, but their water was collected off their roof into a big cistern, and they had an outhouse out back that they used most of the time. They had a huge organic garden that we worked in. They had made their own kayaks, and we went fishing with them. So it wasn't just we hardly talked about birds. It was more just their whole lifestyle of care and concern for the world around them. I mean, it just was huge. I think because they invited us into it, it wasn't like just a lecture or reading a book. It was daily, every day in the summer we'd basically wake up in the morning, go to their house. I mean, they had their own grandkids who we just would play with all summer too. But they just invited us to live with them, and it's sort of by osmosis, that this wonder for creation was kind of grounded into us.
Mm. So then you end up somehow in Lithuania, but return when you get a marriage proposal from a Canadian of Finnish descent?
Yeah, my husband and I were friends before I left for Lithuania, and it was in the early days of email, so we made use of email. I came home, and he's an ecologist by training. He has a master's in soil science. So when I came home, we were praying about what to do next and where to serve, and we wanted to do something together and something, non-traditional. He was working in environmental consulting, and I was teaching. We thought of going back to Lithuania to teach or doing something in campus ministry or something, and we found out, I had already known about this group, A Rocha, and it seemed to combine all our passions for ecology and working with people because interns come, and it just seemed like the perfect fit for both his skills and my skills.
Mm. And so is that where the Portuguese connection comes in?
Yeah, well, the A Rocha started 30 years ago with a couple, Peter and Miranda Harris, who are Brits, but they went to Portugal to start this as part of an Anglican mission to start this. Originally, they were calling it a Christian bird observatory, and so they started that, and they were there for 12 or 14 years, and they took a sabbatical, and during the sabbatical, they came to Vancouver, British Columbia, and taught at Regent College, where I was a student. So I met them there. They taught a class called Incarnational Mission, just looking at new ways for the church to live out the kingdom of God in the here and now. So not traditional, standing on street corners preaching kind of stuff, but, like bicycle repair shop, in Calcutta. Could that be a form of mission? Or could it being a hairdresser in the inner city, could that be a form of mission? And so working in conservation, they said, this is a new form of incarnational mission. It's showing God's love for all of creation. And they are incredibly winsome people, so I just was completely smitten by them, and I had already had this love of creation in me from my childhood on Arcus Island. But I think it was the wedding of this love of creation with this completely integrated Christian faith that they lived out that for me just it captured my imagination, and it captured my husband Marco's imagination because it brought together his skill set and his childhood as a missionary and kid in Nepal. He grew up in Nepal in the Himalayas. So he grew up just hiking, and his class field trips were going on a 3-day trek in the Himalayas. For him, it combined all these things as well.
Yeah. You are an author, but you're not primarily an author.
No, so, I've been the writer for A Rocha for a number of years, but that has mainly entailed writing thank you notes and writing newsletters. And I have written a few articles and chapters in a few books. But primarily I've been working to set up this environmental center. So we lived on site for 7 years with that and welcomed thousands of people and hundreds of interns. So that was a pretty hands-on job, and we have 2 kids as well who are just 10 and 12 now, so that's been, a large portion of my time has gone to parenting them. So this book actually, my husband, I've studied creative writing and did a master's thesis in creative writing, so it's always been a passion of mine, and my husband kept telling me, you need to write down our story, like all these amazing things have happened, and I would sit down to write it and sit there and stare at the blank page for half an hour and say, nope, not the time. And then a few years ago, I just kept waking up at 4 a.m. and just with this compulsion to write, it just sort of flowed out over the course of about 9 months. I really couldn't. It was quite a remarkable experience, getting it on paper and getting it out there. It felt like it was something that had to be birthed.
Mm. That's a great snapshot to kind of get us up to speed on a little bit of your story. And as we transition to some more conceptual stuff, I just wanted to tell you that one of my favorite quotes in your book came early on, and it made me actually laugh out loud. And so I thought that would be a great launching point into this transition. So You said, at the end of a paragraph, in italics, you had a list of questions, and you said, is it worth it? Quitting a secure job, begging for money, selling our house, and moving from our beloved community for what? Seaweed? So what does seaweed have to do with the birds?
Well, early on, we were living in North Vancouver, which is about an hour from where we are now at the environmental center. And my husband, we basically said yes to anybody. We were just ourselves and one other guy, and we're trying to get this whole thing off the ground. And everybody was clueless about, what does Christianity have to do with the environment. Mm-hmm. And so anybody who asked us to do anything, we said yes to. So we had made contacts with these people down here on Boundary Bay, which is this remarkable bay. It's one of the top-rated important bird areas, which is an official international designation in all of Canada. So they were going to be doing this transplanting of eelgrass, which isn't technically seaweed, but it's like long, flat strands of grass, aquatic grass. So it's really important stuff. Juvenile salmon live in it. All sorts of species use it to feed on and hide in. It's kind of it's a key. They asked us to come down, and Marco's a scuba diver, and we asked a friend of ours to come, and they would transplant this seaweed for the afternoon. And our kids were really teeny then, so I had one in a stroller and one I was wearing in this little baby backpack thing. And my husband went down into the water. Marco went down there. Half the guys planting get hypothermia and are out of the water in a couple minutes, and he's still down there. And it was actually quite dangerous because it was so murky. And at one point he looked out at our friend Hans, and this sailboat keel was just passed right in between them, a couple feet from both of them. And it would have knocked one of them out for sure if either of them had been in the way, and you wouldn't have even seen that the guy had gotten knocked out. So it was kind of crazy and dangerous. And meanwhile, I'm on the shore, and my baby, Bryn, falls out of the backpack because I hadn't secured it properly and is wailing, and we have to go to the hospital. And somehow in all this, I'm thinking, what are we doing? Like, my husband is almost getting knocked out by a sailboat underwater. My baby's falling out of a backpack, which had nothing to do with him, but somehow, irrationally, I made this connection that it did. I thought, is this worth it? I don't think this is worth it just for seaweed. But the point of the story is that, if you take anything in isolation, nothing seems worth it. But the whole definition of ecology is that everything is interrelated, because ecology means the study of a household. And a household is really the study is about relationships. So, eelgrass by itself is really not that thrilling or meaningful, but when you consider salmon and their need of eelgrass, and then the relationship of salmon to both the whole ecology of our area of British Columbia and then just economy as well, all of a sudden it becomes quite important. So it was kind of me putting into perspective both this perspective of the interconnectedness, but also just of calling, because I think whatever we're doing, whether any form of social justice, we're always asking in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of it, is this worth it? And I still struggle with that at times, but somehow we have to find meaning. And the way I found meaning is through looking at the bigger picture and the interconnected relationships of things.
My two favorite things about your book, the first is how many different pictures and illustrations you give about how we are all connected in this web of life. And it's really inspiring and humbling, I think, to realize, as you put these different offerings in front of us, what we're really dealing with when it comes to whether you call it creation care or ecology or whatever name you put on it, but this sacred perspective, this posture towards everything that we do and that which influences us. I just loved it, and I'm hoping to bring out some of that in this interview. But my other favorite part in the book was at the beginning of every chapter, you had a quote from some name-recognizable person, and they were just incredible. I actually wrote them all down on their own page. So I just want to read this one, and then I want to talk about Mao's 4 pests.
Okay,
but I really like this quote by John Wesley. I'm a Wesleyan, so this taught me. He said, "I believe in my heart that faith in Jesus Christ can and will lead us beyond an exclusive concern for the well-being of other human beings to the broader concern for the well-being of the birds in our backyard, the fish in our rivers, and every living creature on the face of the earth." I actually didn't know Wesley had said that.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
I'm hoping to use that quote for the whole series because I am just struck by both that perspective, centuries ago, just comes through so crystal clear, but also as a Wesleyan, I'm kind of preferential to that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Mao's 4 pests as an illustration of the interconnectedness here.
Yeah, so Chairman Mao had this idea that, he had all these different campaigns as part of his Great Leap Forward in the 1960s, and one of them was called the 4 Pests Campaign, and his idea that he would, through scientific advisors, identify the 4 pests that were pests to China. So they included house sparrows, flies, rats, and mosquitoes. And the house sparrows one is actually incredibly tragic. What happened? So they landed on the pest list because they eat so much grain, or they are capable of eating 10 pounds of grain a year. And so he thought, well, this is bad. This is going to save us all this grain if we can get rid of these sparrows. So the idea was that every citizen of China would go out into their countryside or the yard outside their house and find swallows' nests. And on one day in spring, and this actually happened, all these citizens of China went outside, and then they went up to the nest and they banged pots, like standing under the trees, and all the sparrows flew out of their nests with their eggs in the nest. And then whenever they would try to fly back, they would stand there and bang the pots. so that the sparrows didn't come back to the nest and all the eggs died, all the fetus and the eggs. And so, you think, oh, this is this great thing. Now all this grain is going to be available for people to eat. But actually what happened is in the next 2 years, China's crops were overrun by insects. And the main insect that was leading the charge was locusts, which is the main diet, actually, of sparrows, house sparrows. So somehow his scientific advisors didn't tell him this. So because all the crops were overrun, there's this huge famine, and people will probably know that 20 million people died in the famine in China during that time. So it's kind of this knock-on effect. You do one thing that you think is going to save you, and actually because you're tinkering with the environment and with these relationships that you don't quite understand, the knock-on effect can actually be quite tragic.
Yeah. I have always bucked a little bit against when people talk about the butterfly effect.
Oh, yeah.
Because it seems too big to go from the flapping of the butterfly's wings to, a hurricane or whatever. But this is a powerful illustration that is only 3 degrees removed from our behavior towards creation and human suffering and people starving. And so I think I'm going to move, whenever people talk about the butterfly effect, I'm going to start channeling that energy towards mouths for pests.
Yeah, it's such a tangible example.
Mm-hmm. So this might be a good time for you to tell us about your mother-in-law's bikini.
This is actually my mother-in-law's favorite part of my book. So my mother-in-law is 70 years old, and she wears a bikini. She's actually in Thailand. They go to Thailand for 4 months every year to help out with a Nepali church. They were missionaries to Nepal for lots of years. So they work there. They stay warm. And she wears a bikini probably every day while she's there. And she wears a bikini not only because she's Finnish, and Finns are quite okay with their bodies. I'm American, and I've inherited that sort of Puritan prudishness, very modest. But Finns, they go in saunas naked. They jump out of the saunas into the snow naked. And so she is Finnish, so that's part of it. But she's also actually a devout Christian. And so I use this example of her wearing a bikini and being okay with her 70-year-old self in this bikini as an illustration for her faith and actually her belief and the biblical mandate, or not mandate, but the biblical doctrine that creation is good, and that in the Genesis accounts, I think we've twisted it sometimes to think that somehow creation is bad because of the doctrine of the fall, but actually every time God in the Genesis accounts creates something, he says, and it was good. He saw what he created, and it was good, it was good, it was good. So trying to counter this notion, I think that especially in some churches that creation is bad and it's this thing that we need to be saved from and it's just for us to use and abuse. But it kind of shifts your perspective when you start to think wow, this is actually something that God delights in, that he created and loves, and things that we don't understand, like house sparrows or mosquitoes, or that somehow there's an inherent goodness to them. So that's where the bikini story took me.
Yeah, and it's that embodied nature of the fact that we don't have this disembodied belief in God, but that we have our actual practices, the way we live is embodied, and that flesh and blood nature, God says, is good.
Yeah.
And I think that's so powerful, and it's the part, we're headed up towards Christmas when we're recording this, even though the series might start in the new year. But it's the amazing part to me every Christmas when we talk about incarnation, to realize that the carnate, that God is perfectly fine with us, and God is with us. And I wish somehow that came through the noise of Christmas more clearly. I think it would really impact our relationship to flesh and blood existence.
Hear, hear. I agree.
So you use Kenya as an illustration of a place that seems very far away and very foreign and alien, to talk about interconnection, and specifically the rural poor and climate change. Maybe you could talk us through how I'm in Los Angeles, and some of the things that you're talking about, and we'll get to a little later in our conversation about how you guys live on your farm. How is that even connected to a faraway place like Kenya?
Yeah. In Kenya, like the example was about things that we're doing there, like with our work with A Rocha and doing these kind of sustainable development things, working with a village there to help preserve the last remnant of this coastal forest that has a few endangered species that actually exist nowhere else on Earth. And so helping them through secondary school bursaries, giving them money for school, and in exchange for that they have to sign a kind of a covenant that they won't use the forest for charcoal. They used to do that so that they'd get the money to send their kids to school, but now since they have these bursaries, they don't have to cut down the forest. So those are things we're doing, and I think that in the U.S. and North America in general, it's not so much the question of what do we need to do, but kind of what do we need to stop doing. And I think it can become really basic. It's as basic as how do we get places and what do we eat, our food and our transportation. And if we even just think that simplistically, agriculture is like the biggest energy consuming thing we do on the planet. So eating locally grown food and organic food and not traveling far if we can help it, and traveling in ways that are earth-friendly, bus and bike. And I say all this, but I have a car and I'm driving my daughter to gymnastics tonight. So I'm not saying this is like this eco-Nazi who's got it all together. But being mindful of these like simple things, and that just our simplest decisions have an impact on the greater world and the climate, and that affects people. I mean, especially in developing countries and sub-Saharan Africa and places that are experiencing drought, in unprecedented ways.
So you were shocked when you first took a little test to see what your ecological footprint might be. And this was a study, I think, developed by a school in British Columbia. I have that right?
University of British Columbia.
University of British Columbia?
Yeah. Yeah, it's called the Ecological Footprint of the Nations, and actually lots of people are using it now for a way to measure. It's actually a great way to talk about conservation, especially with maybe more conservative Christians who aren't or conservative people in general who aren't buying into the climate change conversation. We definitely we know climate scientists. We aren't climate scientists ourselves, but listening to them very much are heeding what they are saying and agreeing with what they're saying. But the Ecological Footprint of the Nations looks at how much land does it take to supply one person with all their food needs, their materials, well, not needs actually, just consumption. So food consumption, everything from housing consumption, and then waste. So you're translating your consumption and waste into a land currency. And so the way it works is that the average American is something like 24 acres per person. And then if you were to extrapolate that and say, okay, now what if everyone on the planet lived at the American standard? We would need 4 to 5 Earths to supply enough land for everybody's stuff and waste. And that obviously is not sustainable. So one thing I just thought, well, gosh, what's mine? Because I thought, our family car is a little Honda Civic, and we never go to big, faraway places for vacation. I took this quiz, and my average came out to, I think, 17 global acres. So it's less than the North American average, but they predict, or they say that you need, for everybody to live sustainably, we can only use like 5 to 6 acres apiece. So I just think our North American way of living is just set up to be overly consumptive. And it's kind of discouraging. So for me, I'm just thinking like, okay, what are the small steps that I can keep taking? Whether that's sharing things, buying fewer things, eating more organic, whatever it is, what are the small steps that I can take to keep whittling down my global share?
Yeah, and I appreciate that you point out that you're not like you're not rabid about this and holding this over other people's heads. In your book, you're so gracious to admit that little things can make a big difference, that in your attempts that you don't always get it right the first time, but you are a vegetarian.
Yeah, it's funny. Funny you should say that. I wrote this book 3 years ago. We have started introducing more meat just because of my family's. My husband, we ate mainly beans. He grew up on lentils every day in Nepal, and somehow he has developed this sensitivity to legumes, ironically, which was the main staple of our diet, which is a bit of a drag. So we've started introducing more meat into our diet. But I was a vegetarian for many years.
Yeah, and we can get to your shaggy cows a little bit later. But do you have this fascinating thing? It's a cheeseburger case study.
Oh, yeah.
And you look at the concentrated animal feeding operations, the CAFOs, you call them, about what it takes to put a hamburger in front of somebody. And some of the stats that come out of this case study, so for a person like me who would think about their ecological footprint, they might say to themselves, I take short showers, to conserve water, and I, make a French press, my coffee in a French press, and kind of pat myself in the back, certainly if I were to take this test, my footprint wouldn't be that big. But that's not where the big problems usually come. Mm-hmm. So much of it is related to food, and specifically factory farmed meat. Mm-hmm. So some of the stats that come out are it takes 75 gallons of oil to bring a single industrial farmed cow from birth to slaughter. So when you think about just getting those 75 barrels of oil and how often that beef is shipped from one state even to another because of the nature of how the beef industry works, the cattle feed yards where they are plumped up at the end of their life, then they're shipped to one of the few slaughterhouses, the processing plants, and just what it looks like to get a hamburger in front of you becomes this major ordeal.
Yeah, staggering. It's 75 gallons, not barrels, but that would be even more staggering.
75 gallons. Oh,
yeah. But I have a friend who runs a grass-fed cattle ranch operation. She actually used to work with us with A Rocha, and she married a rancher out in Manitoba. And she would like me to mention that actually grass-fed and grass-finished beef is completely sustainable. I mean, there's the methane emissions from cattle, which actually is way bigger greenhouse gas contributor than even CO2. But so we're not against eating animals per se. I mean, we're an affiliation of Christians. We allow people to have different opinions. So there are some people who've come and stayed at our center who are strict vegans and would never think, because of just an animal rights perspective, of eating any animal. And then we have other people, especially young guys. We have lots of interns who are, between 18 and 25, and they love meat. We had a guy who was he grew up in South Africa on in a lodge, like a hunting lodge. So his dad would take people on safari. That was their job. And his job growing up from the time he was 13 was to go and hunt the meat for the table at the lodge. So I was asking him, well, what kind of meat would you eat? And he's like, springbok and, impala. And I'm like, oh, my goodness. He was quite distressed at how little meat he was getting at A Rocha, because we do try to eat just meat that is sustainably raised, so free-range chickens, and we had a little tiny herd of cattle that we would eat at the center. But for the most part, we have tried to steer away because it's one of the things that you don't think about, but it's a huge impact on the environment, eating industrially farmed meat.
We have a lot of other things to talk about, but I just find some of the stats about beef production so shocking. Half of all the corn and 90% of all the soybean produced are for industrial animal farms. So half the corn that's grown goes to feeding. But that's not the shocking part. Here's where it hit me. It takes 14 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of edible beef in the factory farm model.
Yeah.
That just seems to, just on sheer efficiency, that's not a good deal.
Right. Those aren't good. That's not a good proportion.
No. You have this amazing quote by Dorothy Sayers. She said, "A society in which consumption has to be artificially stimulated in order to keep production going is a society founded on trash and waste, and such a society is a house built on sand." This culture that we live in is built on perpetual and unlimited growth, and that is housed in consumption. That we have to keep consuming. And you talked about your propensity to buy polo shirts as a young woman.
Yeah.
Where two would have done, there was such a thrill in just buying another one to add to the collection.
Yeah.
So how do we as Christians begin to address this consumeristic pull that is always being advertised, that we need more, that what we have isn't good enough, and that spending a little bit on this would make us so much happier? How do we even begin to address that as believers?
Well, I think the first thing, it's like the 12-step program. It's admitting you have a problem. So Wendell Berry talks about like this never-ending cycle of consumption as like one-night stands. It's just like, oh, I want this, and then you give in, and then you're like, that didn't really satisfy. Okay, I'll go do it again. Yeah. So I think that just realization that, I think this might be a problem. And I think there's also, I've noticed this in North America, this sense of like when you get a really good deal. I've noticed this, it's funny, with Christians, and they're like, God blessed me with, I didn't know they were having a 50% off sale, and I got this thing, and God smiled on me. I'm like, really? So first, just questioning our assumptions and admitting that, yes, we might have a problem. And then I think there's a few things that we can do as Christians that are inherently built into our ethics as Christians. And one is to practice the Sabbath, to just one day a week stop from consuming. So to just say, I'm going to rest this day from buying things and from looking online at things I could buy, or looking at online at all, like just unplugging for a day and being outside. Like we don't always go outside on Sundays, but we try to at least go for a walk or do something, like to be out in creation and to reorient. It's like this recalibration from the day-to-day, must buy this, must do this, must go online and do this, to just like, who am I? I'm a creature in creation. I have a different relationship to this world than what I buy. I am not essentially a consumer. I am a human being. So I think that's one huge thing, and I don't think we can underestimate the power. It's like a ceasing of addiction once a week. And then you find, like, as you do that, it's like throughout the week, it's like, oh, it's not as hard to say no because I've practiced it once a week. And then I think one of the other huge things is gratitude. I think we consume because we're not satisfied. And I was at a conference recently, and the speaker was talking about this study that was recently done. Actually, my sister told me about it too, where they're looking at brain patterns and brain development and looking at gratitude. And perhaps you've seen this. I think it's gone viral. But there's this video with this guy talking about gratitude, and they're doing this survey with these, 4 individuals, and they rate their happiness based on based on their kind of gratitude levels, and they're all like moderately or not very happy. And then they ask them, who are you most grateful for in your life? And then they each say a person. And then they say, okay, we're going to call that person right now, and you're going to say thank you to them for whatever it is. And they're all shocked, like, what, right now? You're going to call them? And they get these people, and some of these people haven't. One guy was their college professor he hasn't talked to in like 30 years. And they all say thank you out loud. This was the part of the study that was interesting. It's not feeling thank you wasn't the big deal. It was actually verbalizing it, that when they charted the brain activity, that something happened in part of their brain that actually developed in their brain, like this sense of contentedness and stuff. And then they rated these people at the end on how happy they were. And after having said thank you, all of them were hugely happier. And the people who were the least happy, after they had said thank you, had the greatest growth margin. So this is all sounds like an aside, but really I think it's essential because we consume because we think we're going to be satisfied by something. But if we're making a practice of saying thank you, of expressing gratitude, even to the small things, and I mean especially to God, but also to people around us, and not just for physical things, but just, you know, like people serving us food or, you know, like anything, I think it builds in us this capacity to resist that, what Wendell Berry calls the consumer one-night stand.
You know, you have a really gracious approach, and towards the end of your book, you have this section called Chucking the Ledger. And I just want to encourage people who are going to buy your book that you don't browbeat us over the head with this dogmatic approach, that it's very practical, and it's very spiritual, and very gracious. And so you talk about this humbling experience where you were so proud of yourself when these leaders from other organization come and saw your laundry line out in your living room, and how great it was. They thought that this was happening, and you're kind of patting yourself on the back, and then the conversation turned towards dishwashers and how much of an energy hog they were. And, of course, you had a brand-new dishwasher that you were enjoying very much.
Mm-hmm. And that I was standing right in front of. I don't think they saw it or noticed it because we were all just bashing, you know, like all these rich people and, you know, all the stuff that they were buying. And, you know, I'm all in it with them. And then they start talking about, and dishwashers. Like, why do people need dishwashers? And let's give that money to the poor and all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah. And I'm standing right in front of our brand new dishwasher.
Which was a quiet model.
Yes. I don't think it was on at the time. That would have been an even better story if it had been on. But
yeah, you say, I'm going to quote you here and then ask you about trying to change the world. You say, a word to the wise, throw out the ledger and foster inward simplicity, out of which will flow the freedom to both embrace the wonderful physicality of the world and its gifts, but also the power to resist consumerism's mirage of satisfaction promised through the purchase of material goods. And you say that you're not, I mean, you talk about McDonald's, you know that your practice in your community of sustainable meat and even proportions of meat to plants, you know you're not going to put McDonald's out of business anytime soon, but your concern is how you treat the land that you guys live on and how you treat your animals. And I think that's an interesting take on that.
Yeah, I mean, we aren't essentially an activist organization. We are active in what we do, and that's one reason why I chose the title, Planted, because I think essentially for each of us, I totally think that activists, you know, like Bill McKibben or other people working for policy change, thank God that they are saying what they're saying and working. We, our calling vocationally has been more active on the ground. So Planted, I chose the title because this is where we're planted. And so we want to look at who we are dealing with. Like, are we treating our neighbors graciously? Are we opening our hearts in hospitality? Like, hospitality in the Greek means like friend of stranger. Like, are we being friends to strangers? And are we caring for the animals and the earth right where we are right now? I applaud the people that do the big campaigns and stuff, and I sign petitions and things like that. But in our day-to-day life, it's what are we doing right now practically where we're planted?
That's great. So with the time we have left, I want to ask you two kind of big picture questions.
Okay.
You tell a story about being Christians in conservation. That was the original name of a group, and how people thought that was an oxymoron. Mm-hmm. And you actually got turned down from having a booth at a Christian conference because they didn't think that was part of the mission. But just a few years later, you guys are leading workshops at that same conference. So have you seen the attitude really change within Christianity and the church towards caring for creation?
We've seen, here's a funny story. We had a booth, or I had a little table at the back of the church. My husband and I did a little talk, and then I went back to stand at the back at the booth after church, and this was right when we were starting out, so like 13 years ago, and nobody came up. And then finally one woman came up, and she looked kind of sheepish, and I'm like, hello, someone come talk to me. She came up and she goes, can I just ask, where did you get your shoes? I was so taken aback. I'm like, what? She liked my shoes.
Oh, no.
So she wanted to know, and then nobody else came up the whole time. So that didn't happen that often, but it wasn't unusual that absolutely no one was interested. And now that there's that conference that we go to, and I think there is a groundswell. I think I don't know if it's trickled down, to just kind of the whole mainstream, especially mainstream evangelical. But I think especially because young people, with this emphasis in the church now on social justice, and people like Shane Claiborne and people like that bringing, helping young people who are a bit disillusioned with Christianity because they're not addressing the real problems in the world right now. I think there is more openness. I think there's a lot to be done, but I think people are seeing that the kingdom of God is big and wide and encompasses more than just human souls. It certainly encompasses human souls, but it's about more than that.
You mentioned 1978 as somewhat of a tipping point ecologically. And down here, we're big fans of John Cobb. And in 1972, he wrote an ecological, he addressed it theologically, in asking the question, is it too late? So I guess I want to ask you, 1972 and 1978 were a long time ago. Is it too late?
You're striking at my sort of my 2 a.m. angsty inner world right here with that question. I don't know. There's I was talking to a friend who said in her degree program in Texas, she's doing environmental studies. Everybody in the program was like, "Yeah, well, the world's done in 2050. Like, we're just going to do the best we can, and then it's done." Like, they're not planning on having kids, and that was sobering to talk to her. I was like, "Really?" Because I have those thoughts, but I also have this kind of Christian theology of hope. And I don't want to be naive about it, because I think Christians often we've stuck our head in the sand about everything from slavery to human rights abuses to lots of things. So just to say, oh, God's in charge, can sometimes let us off the hook. And yet there is this theology in the Bible of the reconciliation, like Colossians 1, God is reconciling all things to himself in Christ. And Romans 8, creation groaning, and God's care for all of creation. So I live in this tension of, at times, extreme anxiety over the state of the world, and then the only thing I can do is just try to live faithfully in my life today and see bigger meaning in the hope that Christ offers us. And I don't have it worked out at all, so I live in that tension.
That is probably the best note we could end on. Tell us how people who have listened and are intrigued by your work, how they can connect with you besides buying the book. By the way, the book is called Planted, A Story of Creation, Community, and Calling. I highly recommend it. But how else can people find you and participate in what you guys are doing around the world?
Yeah, well, A Rocha is an international organization. It's spelled A-Rocha. So there's a movement in the U.S. They don't have a center like we do quite yet. One is kind of coming on board in Texas, but they're also active in Washington State and California, Tennessee, and the D.C. area. So if people want to connect, and then we're active in Canada, in Manitoba, Ontario, and B.C., so people can connect both online, just A Rocha, either .org or .ca if people are in Canada. That's a way that they connect, and there's conversations happening. There's more on the ground, and there's ideas, especially for churches. We have something in Canada called Good Seed Sunday, and ideas for how churches can both green their space, and there's actually sermon outlines, and there's curriculum for Sunday schools and things. Because we don't hold like big national conferences, we want people to do stuff locally where they are, so we're happy to help facilitate that through these resources.
That's great, and we'll put up links to everything. So if you want to follow up on this, on the show notes, on both the blog and on the iTunes page, you'll be able to follow up and connect with Leah and this work. I want to thank you so much for taking. I know that you have a busy life and a ton of other things, and so I want to thank you so much for taking all of this time to talk with us today.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed it. I forgot one thing. I also have a website, just leahkostamo.com, so people can get in touch if they want to like message me personally with questions or anything. They can reach me that way.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.